Much for joining us today for our final science talk of 2025. I'm delighted to welcome you. My name is Dr. Miriam Axel, and I'm thrilled to be your host. I'd like to remind you that this talk, as well as all of our other talks, will be recorded and is available on our website at unu.edu/INWEH/science-talks with an S at the end. And today it's my real pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Gary Lewis. Professor Lewis is a professor of practice on human and environmental security at the United Nations University, and he's a senior advisor on environmental security, drug control, and operational leadership in a wide range of complex settings. Over his 35-year career with the United Nations, he served as the UN resident coordinator in Iran and held several director-level positions across multiple UN agencies, including UNEP, UNDP, and UNODC. His work has taken him all across South Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, often at the intersection of conflict, development, and environmental risk. What sets Professor Lewis apart is his depth of on-the-ground experience combined with a strong commitment to human security, environmental stewardship, and long-term solutions to global challenges. And now, without further ado, it is my great honor and pleasure to turn it over to you, Professor Lewis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miriam, and hello to everyone who is on the call. I'd like to start by saying the following. Essentially, I'd like to start by saying that, in my opinion, the defining story of the 21st century will boil down to a race between the cumulative impact of our carbon emissions and our belated but accelerating efforts to replace fossil fuels with clean, renewable energy. In this context, as the century progresses, the main questions surrounding world peace will revolve around how we prevent elements of our Earth system from collapsing. Let me pause to say, Miriam, I wonder if you could switch the slides, because thanks very much. The other way around, please. Right, thanks. We'll bring up the content when that part comes in the presentation. So thank you very much. Today's topic focuses on the need for a policy reset on climate change. Please note that I'm using the term climate change as a shorthand for global heating, but bundled into this shorthand is also the effect on the Earth system of human-made ecological degradation. For they're all connected. I'd like to focus most of this science talk on solutions, but in order to set the scene for what I wish to recommend as policy resets, I think it's necessary to first share a little on what I consider to be the gravest threats that we face. Now, most of you who've signed on for this talk will be well informed on the crisis of global heating. So I apologize in advance for repeating things you may already know. Please also let me start with a couple of caveats. I'm not a scientist, and I am not even perhaps an environmentalist in the strict sense of what that word means. But as Miriam has just kindly outlined in her introduction, I've spent a lot of my working life on the ground trying to address some of the world's darkest problems, whether in the form of slavery to drugs or slavery to other human beings. And yet, despite all of this, I have come to the conclusion that after 35 years in the UN, I believe the crisis of global warming is what presents us with our greatest civilizational challenge. So here's an overview of today's presentation. Thank you, Mary. And I start with a few of the dimensions of threat which I believe should be restated. So let's just focus on point number one and then move back off the presentation. Right, that's where we are now. Right, so last year was the hottest year on record. If you look at the numbers, 2025 will be, when taken a 3-year average, will be the first year where we have exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the Paris threshold for us to not exceed, ideally, at the end of this century, and yet we've done it 10 years after Paris. In addition, At the recent COP30, the world's leadership formally and finally acknowledged what the numbers have been telling us for some time, which is this, what I just said, that we'll not stay below the aspirational Paris ceiling of 1.5 degrees of warming. The World Meteorological Organization is also recently reporting record high and accelerating rates of atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions. And there's no doubt that this will lead to severe economic and ecological consequences. So here are some of the climate indicators, all of which, without exception, are worsening. We have global ice loss. We have record heat waves, ocean temperatures rising, and which are also kicking off major heating in the atmosphere and driving an acceleration of the hydrological cycle. We're seeing coral reefs die off. That's probably one of the tipping points that's already gone. Floods, storms, droughts, sea level rise at a rate that will likely increase our sea level by about 1 meter by the end of this century, which is phenomenal when you consider what that means. Not just that the level will rise, but the storm surges that will come and the intrusion into freshwater systems and how that will degrade people's human security. Now, present climate policies put our climate warming on a trajectory that's just under 3 degrees Celsius at the end of this century. Most worryingly, the Earth system features several tipping points. This is the point beyond which humans no longer control the addition of excess greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Is the point at which no options, in effect, remain under our control for cooling the climate. These tipping points themselves drive self-reinforcing feedback loops, and I'll list a few here, like the warming of the oceans. I mentioned that already. Shrinking of the Arctic ice sheet, which will reduce the amount of white surface on the planet that can reflect radiation back into the solar system. The thawing of permafrost, the dieback of the Amazon rainforest and other forests as well, slowing of the Atlantic ocean circulation. All this ought to cause us alarm. So, in my view, the evidence is in. Climate chaos will definitely worsen. And in terms of its impact on security and conflict, which is subject to our talk today, it will serve as a threat multiplier, a risk accelerator, and a crisis amplifier. The evidence shows that climate change impacts tend to operate through a number of pathways, and they produce a spectrum of negative political consequences. These are consequences stretching from protests, strikes, and riots, which you see in different parts of the world, through insurgency, rebellion, and terrorism, leading eventually, in some cases, to war. These processes are often driven by some combination of bad governance, poor mediation, and political exclusion of one or other group. They operate within countries and between countries. I will give a few examples during the course of the presentation. So ultimately, this is on us. The future is happening now, and every half a degree of warming matters. More warming is inevitable, but all is not lost. Some of you are already engaged in finding solutions. So the purpose of today's talk is to make us all more empowered in our tasks. This short overview update outlining the extent of the threat is the first of 5 areas I'd like to cover in our talk today. So let's move to the second, which is security in the Anthropocene. Thank you. Now, given the limited time we have, I won't go into the origins and evolution of the various academic concepts of security. I will rather just focus on the one that appeals to me the most, just as much now as it did when it was first made. It made its appearance back in 1994 in a UN Human Development Report. This is the concept of human security. Now, human security explicitly underscores the essence of what should be secured, and this is the human being, rather than exclusively the state. It is people who should become, therefore, the objective of true security thinking. Here's a diagram of the key elements of human security. This page down, please. Thank you. I won't go through them in detail. I can if people want afterwards, but to me, they're rounded and they literally as well. And they cover most of what it is required to make us secure in our community. So health, having a job, having enough to eat, having the ability to express yourself, political, environmental, and personal, not being constantly exposed to crime. These are things that secure the human being, hence human security. And I would lead on from this to say that in the age of the Anthropocene, humanity's current focus on hard security, which is like borders, weapons, exclusivist concepts of sovereignty, these all tend to produce path-dependent reflex responses. Sadly, this is an approach that humankind has relied upon for centuries. But the ground realities have changed dramatically in the past half century, in my opinion. It is now undeniable that our ability to survive on this planet is crucially linked to the health of our biosphere. Viewed in these terms, conducting relations exclusively from the parochial notions of what we think is our national self-interest, so-called, is simply no longer credible. This is because such an approach puts every state's national self-interest in peril. So, to our first policy reset, I believe that national self-interest must no longer be defined without regard to the condition of the biosphere. I believe that this statement, what I just said, will sound less and less naive as the century progresses and as we face environmental catastrophes of unimaginable ferocity. Practical consequences of this will require, policy reset-wise, an overall reconceptualization of what security means. We need to demilitarize the concept of security. We need to build on human security and eventually go even further to recognize the importance of ecological security. This is a concept dramatically more all-embracing than human security, but let's take one step at a time. Let's stick to embedding human security in our policy architecture. Now, please have a look at the diagram that Miriam is kindly putting on screen now. It appeared in a book that I contributed to a couple of years ago. As you can see, you have the reference to the traditional state-centric security system based on the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, evolving more broadly into the late part of the 20th century in human security, and something that I believe aspirationally we need to embrace as a real concept of security in order to live and move and have our being with some degree of safety on this planet in the 21st century. Happy to explain anything that's unclear in the Q&A segment at the end. Now, aside from integrating environment to all future security considerations, I believe that practical implications must also involve a recalibration of how military support is rendered through aid to the civilian authority and humanitarian assistance in disaster response. These are very important areas that we will start to see the military become very involved in as a result of climate change and ecological breakdown. Okay, so now that we've dealt with a couple of the why questions, let's move on to some of the what and how questions. First of all, let's look at the pathways in which climate change and ecological degradation will make an impact on human security. I'm suggesting in the slide that Miriam has kindly put on screen that there are essentially four. I believe that climate change and ecological breakdown will increasingly determine the way in which food, energy, and water, along with their respective supply chains, can be accessed. It will also impact where people can live or are forced to live, in other words, displacement. Now, time won't allow me today to go into each of these pathways. There will be given more visibility in the e-learning course. We are currently preparing for the UN University's UNWEH faculty, which is very kindly hosting today's meeting. But I'll focus on only two of these. Remember, we were looking at food, energy, water, and displacement. I'll focus on energy and water. On to energy. Pathways to insecurity or security, if it's well handled. Now, most countries normally focus their energy priorities in two or maybe three goals. These are energy security, cheap energy, and clean energy. And energy security, I believe, will remain a major focus of global stability or instability in the years to come. We can see this when we look at the recent and current conflicts, in fact, in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Asia. But related to climate change and associated mitigation efforts, we need to focus on two other linked security elements, I believe. The first is what is now being called solar rivalry. Solar rivalry. And so essentially, it means that as renewables replace fossil fuel, solar power becomes much more important as a new strategic resource. Future conflicts over solar resources will arise. And this will include competition for things like high irradiance territories, control over advanced solar infrastructure, and access to critical minerals, such as lithium and rare earth elements. And this brings us to the second element related to energy security, the competition for rare earths. The world needs clean power, but decarbonization calls for a massive increase in the mining and extraction and recycling, indeed, of minerals and metals like lithium, graphite, and cobalt. Now, access to these critical minerals and other rare earths is vital, I believe, for digital low-carbon transitions in key greenhouse gas emitting countries. And global competition for these resources is therefore inevitable. Now, because the most accessible supplies are located in tropical regions, often within so-called fragile states, this is where most of the anticipated conflict will erupt. In both cases, therefore, solar rivalry and for rare earths, what the world now needs is some form of governance mechanism. This is another reset policy issue. Governance mechanism, inclusive technology sharing, and multilateral cooperation. These are potential reset areas of policy focus. However, most of the policy resets relating to energy security concern mitigation and how to achieve it. And this I believe is a really critical point. If we reduce emissions, then the risks of the climate-related conflicts will also recede. Many of the conflicts that I'll be talking about in the rest of this presentation, they will recede. So let me talk a little bit about energy and the way in which we can try to improve our ability to mitigate the emissions. Our global emissions strategy right now continues to be heavily wedded to net zero policies. In principle, this makes sense, but we haven't managed to reduce emissions effectively. In fact, they continue to rise. The solution, we keep telling ourselves, is to cut carbon emissions. The point is, we're not doing it nearly fast enough or broadly enough. So here on screen is my own list of policy approaches. They're listed in no particular order. And I believe that we must employ them to reduce emissions and thereby improve human security into the 21st century. You can read them for yourself. I'm not going to go through them right now, given the limited time. But I would say this, in terms of prioritization, and in addition to continuing to try to cut emissions, as a policy reset, I would recommend that global leaders focus not exclusively, obviously, but much more heavily on the last two solutions. That is exploring geoengineering and cutting short-lived climate pollutants, especially methane. In the Q&A session, I'm happy to go into either of those. But if you look at methane, which has 80 times the heating power of CO2, lasts in the atmosphere for only 12 years, is traceable back to three main sources, which is gas flaring, cows in agricultural production, and the methane emissions that come off of municipal waste dumps. These are things that can be dealt with very, very effectively. If done effectively, we have calculated that we can reduce our emissions by 0.3 of a degree over the next 15 years. This is that's a major amount of reduction. So I think that's something that's worth looking at. Now, still staying on energy and how we can better mitigate emissions as a way of safeguarding human security, I'd like to add the following three areas of global cooperation. This is things that will need to be done not on a technical basis, but between nations to encourage a reduction in emissions. Essentially, three more policy resets. The first is that we need to secure firm greenhouse gas reduction agreements from the 20 largest emitters through a slimmed-down negotiation process, co-developed and led by China and India. I focus on China and India because they are among the largest emitters right now, but they also show immense potential to redirect efforts towards cleaner energy. For this reason, I believe, and the sluggishness of some of the other countries, they must take the lead, and they must push for strong commitments from other top emitting countries and show that they themselves can do it. Because quite frankly, friends, what China and India do in the next 10 years on emissions will make or break our planet. And that's a strong statement to make, but I believe it can be backed up by evidence. It will make or break our planet. Secondly, we must increase finance for climate change mitigation and adaptation in the global south. That's important because it is from the global south that most future energy demand expansion will come. And then finally, and also be quite controversial, especially for colleagues in the UN who are maybe sitting in on this call, we need to reduce the frequency and improve the structure of events like the COP and the recently concluded UN Environment Assembly. Happy to go into the details in the Q&A. But these events consume far too much time and energy for the results that they do or do not deliver. Let's now move to water. Thank you, Miriam. Here, the impacts are much more immediate in terms of environment and security. They're much more immediate and visible on the ground. I'd say that if mitigation efforts are mainly related to energy, then adaptation efforts need to be mainly looking at water and food. I'd say, from personal experience on the ground, that the strongest environment security nexus is you can see when two elements collide. First is climate exposure. We've talked about this a little bit before. I listed some of the points at the top of the discussion. So you're talking about droughts, unpredictable rainfall, storms, floods, sea level rise. But if this combines with what is called state fragility, then you get problems, big problems. And so state fragility, I won't go into extensive academic discussion on the matter, but you're talking about two things: legitimacy and effectiveness. Legitimacy in terms of, do the citizens of the country, or most of the citizens of the country, agree with the political structure and the way in which they are given access to and voice in the political system? And effectiveness means, is the state delivering basic services like electricity, water, and access to food? Are the laws in place and regulations? Does it communicate effectively with the citizens when crises are arising? These are things that are really important. So legitimacy and effectiveness are essential to reduce the essence of state fragility. I believe that vulnerability to climate change and state fragility, these things correlate strongly and they feed off of each other. For example, I was looking at some recent research which shows that 70% of the most climate vulnerable countries are also the most fragile countries. And the risk of water-related conflicts, since we're talking about water, occurs both within countries and between countries. So let's look at the first case of within a country. There are many places that I could, drawing on some things that I've done in the past, that I could talk about, not least Iran, where water is essentially the key security issue in that country, whether the authorities wish to recognize it or not. You're following it right now with talk about shifting the capital and the fact that the aquifers are dry. Again, happy to discuss more in the Q&A, but I chose rather to talk about Sudan in the period of 2012 to 2022. Sudan, as you know right now, is undergoing, especially in Darfur and some of the other parts of the country, essentially hell on earth with destruction and an ethnic killing, humanitarian crisis, food crisis that is not getting nearly enough attention in the international media, and not getting nearly enough attention in terms of responses that can cope with the hell that folks on the ground are facing. I'm not going to talk about what's happening now. I'm using the Sudan example simply to talk about what the United Nations, as part of it at the time, what we tried to do in the period 2012 to 2022 in North Darfur, which is the epicenter of what's happening now. But essentially, what we were able to do is to demonstrate that Although droughts and unpredictable rainfall and floods increase tensions between pastoralists and farmers, with conflict predictors being high dependency on agriculture, water deficit, exclusionary politics, the prevalence of arms and non-state armed groups. We found that through effective engagement, conflict can be avoided. The specific example I would choose to elaborate some more in the discussion is of a place called Wadi El Ku, where we engaged in two essentially approaches, where we worked with the communities to put in place hardware, canals and weirs and functional irrigation systems and on-farm water management and water access and seed beds and so forth. And on the soft side, we worked through mediation and with the communities, involving people in discussions, including the pastoralists, who are very hard to get hold of because they're obviously moving all the time. And so they don't have time to come sit around under a tree and discuss things. But it was possible to get success in those cases. And I believe that these are things that we can recommend both nationally and internationally as policy resets. So you're talking about mediation, peace building, and integrating environmental security considerations into all elements of peace building. I'd like to use this opportunity, since we're talking about potential conflicts within a country, to touch on two more important things. And this is really the issue of knowing and trying to anticipate the eruption of violence. Early warning and horizon scanning, essential. And with the power of the internet now, there's so much that can be done to alert ourselves more than, for example, we were able to do 30 years ago in Rwanda, 31 years ago, effectively, when the killing started. I believe that if we invest in early warning and in horizon scanning, we can analyze better the convergence of stressors, some of which actually may currently not be known, hence over the horizon scanning. This will require a combination of expert opinion, getting people, advising leaders who have deep local and national knowledge, but it also requires data mining. So you're looking at capturing sentiment analysis, like hate speech on social media, remittance trends. Are the remittance trends from family members overseas, are they drying up? Meaning that people will be more insecure, they will have livelihood insecurity on the ground. Can we look at satellite or sensor data on environmental trends? What's the water scarcity level like? Is the hydrothermal coefficient, is it acceptable? How are things working, excuse me, with rainfall and forest cover? What we need to do is better identify patterns. It's not a perfect science, but it really does help to anticipate problems. Right now, actually, it's probably interesting for some of you to know that we are looking closely at the world's first Environment Security Intelligence Center. It's just been established in Jordan, and it's trying to generate foresight on risks and threats and ensure knowledge fusion and refine communication in order to get it to the decision makers in time, and then build response preparedness through simulation exercises, practical simulation exercises, often involving the government. I can tell you from having spent a lot of time in the UN, we don't do that type of training nearly enough. We talk about some of the ways in which we could improve our approach, but simulation exercises are absolutely essential and we don't do them enough. At the international level, still on water, I'd like to, so we're now moving away from Sudan, I'd like to talk a little bit about what happens at the international level when the great rivers fail as a result of climate change. So I'll use an example, hypothetical, but there's enough evidence in there that you will be able to figure out which countries I'm talking about. I'm not naming them, but the scenario is as follows. One mountain range delivers headwaters feeding two large countries. Rivers are mainly controlled by country A. Rivers run through country A into country B. Country B is massively food dependent on the flow of the river system. Country A has the ability to control water in entering country B. Country A does this through dams that can divert more water into their own agriculture areas before it reaches country B. When this happens, it causes a drought in country B. Or, alternatively, when the rivers are full of meltwater, country A can allow the onrush of water into country B, thereby flooding it. On current trends for the next 10 years, climate change will produce much more snowmelt. This will create the possibility of floods in spring and summer. How the water is managed will determine the potential conflict. But as the meltwater starts to diminish, say after 10 years, drought, scorching, immense drought will be the new climate change threat. Water will be scarce. Now let's add a couple more threats. Each of these countries bears enormous enmity against the other for historical and cultural reasons. Both countries possess a large stock of nuclear weapons. The risk is obvious. Should a water-driven conflict occur, and should it escalate to the use of nuclear weapons, millions, possibly hundreds of millions, will be left dead or dying. And that's just the start in the immediate vicinity. The threat for the rest of the region will come through wind-borne spread of radioactive dust. What would the logical policy resets be? One is something I've already mentioned, and that is we need to redefine. Excuse me. Just give me a sec. We need to redefine what security means, friends. In this example, we have priorities that are massively misaligned. Both countries are trapped in outdated concepts of security. At present, vast amounts of human and financial resources have been mobilized to deter military aggression, but hardly any money is devoted to preventing the annihilation that will result from climate breakdown. So you have a paradox. Climate change is producing actual lived disasters right now in terms of droughts and floods in each of these countries. However, I would say the arms race is treated as sacrosanct. And I know I've worked in both of these countries. The paradox turns into a security paradox, where significant resources are dedicated to deterring hypothetical military threats, while immediate climate-related disasters like floods in country B and heat waves in country A are way down the priority list. They both are unfunded and both are devastating. So we need to spend, again, reset of perspective number 2 on this particular case. You spend more on adaptation to climate change. This means building better agricultural and urban resilience options for both countries. Details can be discussed. The third dimension of the reset is that, and this is the first time I've used this term in the talk today, ecological diplomacy. Ecological diplomacy. I hope this will become a more commonplace term in the future. Our objective would be to leverage diplomacy and to shift security doctrines away from pure concepts of military confrontation towards a shared action on climate adaptation. Here are some of the elements. We can get bilateral task forces in place to monitor and advise on water flow trends. We can ensure that water ceasefire provisions come into effect during political and military crises. We can establish coordinated transboundary water management for early warning, similar to what I just talked about a few minutes ago. I'd like to now move to the last segment of the presentation, and that is on future polycrises. We can just get that slide up. Thank you very much. According to a 2025 report by the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, the world experienced a huge surge of armed conflicts in 2024, i.e. last year. In fact, in 2024, there were more conflicts at play than at any time since 1945. A total of 61 armed conflicts were recorded across 36 countries. Several nations experienced multiple simultaneous conflicts. Frankly, the world is now much more violent and divided than it was 10 years ago. Geopolitical fragmentation is at Cold War levels, the levels that I remember being at play when I joined the UN back in 1987. In recent decades, the world has shifted from an American-led unipolar order to an emerging multipolar system. But the new system is one whose features remain uncertain. Countries are realigning themselves, therefore, to a new and rapidly shifting geopolitical environment. Now, as I said at the beginning, into this will come the climate chaos And that will worsen all these trends. Remember the phrases I use: threat multiplier, risk accelerator, crisis amplifier. Sound global leadership is therefore required for us to overcome our dividedness. We must prepare for the worst, but because frankly, when some of these crises come, they will come all at once, hence the polycrisis concept. A good example would be multiple simultaneous crop failures across the planet, again, as a result of climate change. We're talking about unanticipated but synchronized breadbasket failures. How could this happen? Well, if you look at our global industrial food production, first thing you notice, it's highly concentrated in a number of ways. It focuses largely in terms of staples on 3 crops. And they're largely homogeneous. Their inputs, their production methods, and the trade routes and supply chains that are used to deliver food to us are extremely vulnerable to a number of critical incidents. In our hyper-connected world, I'd say that future polycrises will be complex, they'll be wicked, massive, and non-linear. The main concern we should have is that these polycrises will often be driven in future by climate change and ecological breakdown. In terms of anticipating and reducing the potential impact of polycrises, there are many things that can be done now, involving fewer, more influential countries on emissions mitigation, or what some people like to call minilateralism, as opposed to multilateralism, minilateralism. This means that we should actively seek alternative forms of collective action, including outside the United Nations, as complements to and often substitutes for traditional international cooperation. Thus, we talk about minilateral rather than universal, voluntary rather than legally binding, and disaggregated rather than comprehensive. Okay, I'd like to conclude now by saying that today I've suggested some of the policy areas that global leaders need to recognize as part of a reset. First of all, we must focus on human security. I then went on to suggest that we need to conceptualize and implement ecological security. I suggested using this to better frame peace building and mediation efforts to avoid low intensity intra-state conflict. I've suggested instrumentalizing ecological diplomacy to diminish the risk of high intensity interstate conflict over water, food, and energy. I suggested more investment in anticipatory governance, especially in early warning and horizon scanning, as well as better adaptation to prevent conflict. And in anticipating and responding to polycrises, I've just made a few suggestions as well. For in the end, we need to get ourselves out of our current climate paradox. Here's the paradox, another one of them in this presentation. We live in a world of rising greenhouse gas emissions and record-breaking temperatures. Our awareness of this danger has never been higher, and yet our political will to respond seems to be diminishing at the very moment that the crisis is worsening. Friends, my job in this talk has been to try to trace out a few pathways we can use to safeguard human security in the future. As future leaders, I would ask you to consider my suggestions, and if you accept them, or if you accept any of them, then find ways to help us to implement the policy resets that we so desperately need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lewis, for a really fabulous talk. I guess I'd like to start with a question that we have from the audience. If you're, oh,
okay, thank you very much for emphasizing the importance of demilitarizing security terminology. But I'm wondering, in a situation of armed conflicts where water resources are often weaponized or militarized, how might this principle be practically applied?
Okay. Can I ask for your name, please, ma'am?
Reem. My name is Reem.
Reem. Thank you for your question. How can it be practically applied? Well, first of all, in we can apply it practically in anticipating the conflict in advance. And I talked about when I talked about the example of the two countries at war. I use an example that allowed us to think about, first of all, recategorizing security, as you've referred to. I also talked about the need to spend more in anticipation on adaptation to climate change, and then dealing with ecological diplomacy. You know, there's actually an interesting academic debate on this. There is a view that in water, there will be no or few water wars in the future. That water diplomacy can be a pathway to peace and not war, for example, using experienced facilitators and long processes and strengthening water resource management. I have to tell you that, in my view, I don't share the optimism of some of those who say that the talk of water wars is misplaced and that water cooperation as a vehicle for peace will be an easy way in to resolving conflict. And I say this because a number of reports, specifically from I'm looking at one or two here, the Global Peace Index, Control Risks Analysis of Threat, and most importantly of all, the Water Conflict Chronology that's produced by the Pacific Institute, is talking about the rapid escalation of conflicts over water between and within countries in the last decade, an alarming rise of water-related conflicts in the last few years, and the issue of equitable distribution and so forth. So if you're saying that a conflict over water having broken out, what do we do? Then all I can say is that we address the issue in the way that, I mean, the people will die. There's no question about it. And all that we can do is, after preventive diplomacy has failed and peacemaking mediation has failed, what we can do, whether it's bilateral, multilateral armed intervention to try to separate the warring parties, is to impose peacekeeping and peace-building efforts and societal development, sustainable development. There's not going to be an easy solution. But I mean, if I can just jump off on something that you've said, I'd like to add that, Miriam has mentioned that I spent some time in Iran, and I referred to that as well. And the idea of getting the concept to demilitarize the concept of security is really, really difficult. It's already heavily entrenched in the minds of many policymakers. The word for security in Farsi is amniyat. And I remember once mentioning that to some senior policymakers in terms of the security threat, the human security threat that Iran faced. And I remember that the reaction was not positive, because their view was that the United Nations should not be talking about security in Iran and so forth. So, and I was not talking about, the borders and the weapons and this sort of thing. I was talking about people's ability to succeed in having a decent, humane livelihood according to the 7 principles of the human security concept. But even that mention, and even after I had explained it, there was still there was a bristling. They were very concerned that I was mentioning this. And I dare say that there are very few countries that have really absorbed the concept of human security and anticipating these types of ecological confrontations over many things, including water. So I thank you for your question. I may not have answered it in a way that you find satisfactory, but those are the elements that I think we need to be teasing out and playing with in order to find a solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gary. My question, I'll categorize it as it may be basic, but at the core, I would say. Jumping off on the part of the last statement, 7 principles of human security. one of the ways in which we normally meet the fundamentals is when they're not mainstream. Throughout your talk, you alluded to the role of water in the midst of water security. I mean, the midst of human security. But the principle of water is not captured within the 7 principles. So the moment is not mainstream, it distorts the whole fundamentals. So that's my own worry, and that's my own issue. Water will always be at the core of human development, one, and because it's at the core of human development, it will also always be at the core of human security. So if the fundamental is missing, the fundamental pillars, are not complete, then haven't we gotten it all wrong right from the basic? My query to you.
Okay, I take your point. I mean, on the ground and in the various places where I worked, this never raised its head as a conceptual problem to the extent that practical people working on the ground and even in bureaucracies worry about these definitional issues. I'd say I'd go further to say that when you look at human security, there are elements that do require water security. It's implicit, it's embedded. I mean, health, for example, nutrition, having a safe enough environment, medical environment, health environment. Health security also involves trying to avoid new and recurrent diseases. That's related to water. In terms of economic security, we're talking about assuring a basic income involving a decent livelihood, which means that you have to have water and sanitation, clearly. With regard to food security, having water is going to be essential in preventing hunger and famine. And I mean, it's embedded also in environmental security. So I think it's there. It may not be at a level that will satisfy everyone. And I don't think the concept of human security will necessarily satisfy anyone. And I can just imagine the number of late nights on whiteboards for Mahbubul Haq and the other folks that came up with this idea back in the early 90s to try to conceptualize and frame what are the essential elements of human security. And I think they've done a pretty good job. Water may not be there prominently, but it's definitely embedded. Back to
Thank you, Gary. That's exactly my point. Thank you for articulating the central role of water in all those elements that you talked about. But my issue is the moment water, as important as it is not mainstream. Highlighted separately. They will always overlook it. And that's one of the things that got us to where we are. So now, in the spirit of policy research, my fundamental thing will be consider mainstreaming water as one of the pillars. So it turns from 7 principles to 8 principles because it is so integrated into any other dimensions that anybody wants to think about.
Okay, thanks. That sounds like a statement, so I won't react to it other than to say that one of the greatest achievements, aside from the Paris Agreement about 10 years ago, is this thing that I've got on my jacket, which I wear with great pride because I think it is still something that we all should elevate as a set of goals, and that's of course the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, as you know, one of the Sustainable Development Goals is in fact related to water, number 6. Back to you.
I was actually just going to riff off of this conversation a little bit, Dr. Lewis, and just thinking about the variety of frameworks, that we have. And so, I come from the global health space, and, in public health, we talk about the social determinants of health, which I see, so much overlap when we think about human security and social determinants of health, those 2 frameworks. And so I guess I wonder about how various disciplines, like the training that we come up with, and the sectors, you know, that we our experience falls within, you know, what is the role, I guess, going forward, even in terms of multilateralism, and when we're talking about, you know, governance structures? In your opinion, can you just talk a little bit about the role of consolidation and transdisciplinary thinking and working as we move forward, you know, from a kind of systems and governance standpoint? It's a broad question, but your thoughts.
Well, what I'd like to say is that what I really would like to see is an end to this paradox that I referred to at the end of my talk, where we have a massive accumulation of evidence of the extent and nature and pattern of the threat that our climate poses to us, and what because of what we've done to the climate over the past 2 centuries, but acceleratingly. I mean, we've done much worse, much more damage in the last 30 years than we've done in the preceding part of 200 years. So we've done this knowingly. This was done after Rio. We've done this knowingly, and we, as I said, when we're talking about energy, we've done so little to reduce it. Paris has put in place a number of things, the national determined contributions that, if applied, will bring us in just under 3 degrees. I doubt that, because of the tipping points and the feedbacks that I've talked about, and which not enough attention is given to these things, which will flip this seeming progression that we have, you know, of adding a number of parts per million every year. So I would like to see the whole dialogue transformed by enlightened, purposeful leadership. And that enlightened and purposeful leadership will seek to address issues such as what you have outlined. The fact that we're still talking for half an hour has got me a little bit. Let me just check out if this will help. Hang on. I'd like to see no decisions made without reference to the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the Sustainable Development Goals, you've got all 17, pretty much everything is covered, and you've got your indicators and your verification markers. I think that purposeful and energetic and insightful leadership ought to break down a lot of the silos that I see happening, silos that I witness happening in the United Nations as well. But it really requires leadership. That is why I referred 4 or 5 times in my talk to leadership. So that, for example, someone that is that is convening a meeting of the national intelligence organizations will have an environmental expert in there. Will have someone who understands about water and health security in there, and not just folks that have, you know, with all due respect, have spent their lives looking at the possibility of deterrence and what tanks can do and missiles and so forth. There's a different reality that we have to base ourselves in, and it is called the Anthropocene era, which I talked about in the talk. And that is essentially because we are now the terrors of the ecosystem on this planet, whether we accept it or not. That's what we are, and so we need to act accordingly and responsibly. Now, I've given you probably an equally broad answer, but I think that that's where we need to focus, and we need to get leadership and we need to elect leadership in those countries where elections matter, that understands these issues and can take purposeful action, and not just look at the issues as if they will come to the end. You need to secure success and survival at the end of the week, which is on the normal political horizon. We need strategic leadership on these issues, thinking in decades down the line.
Well said. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you about a point that you've sort of touched on is the role of the UN, and particularly the UN Security Council, and whether that role, if this concept of human security needs to evolve. Now, you talked about the poly crisis, all of these overlapping different crises, social, environmental. Where do you see the role of the UN Security Council, and does that need to change?
Yes, is the short answer. It does need a change, but and I mean I can give some personal experience on this. I've had extensive conversations with one or two representatives at the ambassadorial level of two of the Security Council members, and they are dead set against environmental security being considered in the Security Council's deliberations, because they see it as a way that can be used to intervene in the internal affairs of a specific country or any given country. They see it as the potential to erode national sovereignty, which is, as I said earlier, I think it's very myopic at a time when we are in a boat that's sinking and it's all hands on deck and we all have to pull. So I think that there has been, I mean, it's essentially been 15 or so years since the UN Security Council started looking at it. We have had different statements made, but there's a tension within the UN Security Council that there are some countries that agree to proceed with environmental security as an issue, and others that are dead set and they're opposed to it, and the veto is there. What has happened is that you've had ways of trying to get around this, and people have referred to the fact that Article 24 gives the Security Council the mandate to deal with all threats to peace, and it is quite clear that, I mean, if my talk is to be believed, that we have a clear and present danger in global warming and ecological breakdown. So to me, it's more a political resistance. And looking back in 10 years, when the storms of our grandchildren will hit us even harder, I wonder if there will be any reflection on the time that was lost. I would add one last thing. When I was, the last work I did with the UN was as a director in the UN Environment Program. And as such, I was responsible for the UN's work at a stratospheric level on climate security. There's something called the climate security mechanism, which is in play. And it combines the best elements of UN Environment Program, UN Development Program, and the Department of Political and Peacekeeping Affairs. So that mechanism is there, and it is producing slowly insights and toolkits and things for UN leaders and others to use. But I would like, I mean, but you've asked about the UN Security Council. I've talked to you a little bit about that and other mechanisms. I mean, one of the key players in the United Nations in terms of function and a role is what I used to do, the resident coordinator. Got about 120 of us, or former me's, in the right now operating in many countries, but the level of understanding of the environment security issue is just not there. Most of my colleagues and former colleagues are development folks, and so they have a reluctance to touch anything that is connected to security. And even when cast as human security, and even 30 years after the UN Development Program introduced the concept of human security, there's still that reluctance. So we have a long way to go, even to the acceptance of human security as something that's fundamental and needs to be worked on. Back to you.
Thank you so much. This was really a fabulous talk. And yeah, really thank you. I think we could keep you here all day with the questions. It's really fascinating to learn from your experience. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Thank you for all of those of you joining us online for our final science talk of 2025. And we look forward to welcoming you back in 2026.
Thank you all. And for those of you celebrating Christmas and New Year, have a very good one.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, bye.